This is Your Anxiety Toolkit, episode 109. Welcome to Your Anxiety Toolkit. I'm your host, Kimberly Quinlan. This podcast is fueled by three main goals. The first goal is to provide you with some extra tools to help you manage your anxiety. Second goal, to inspire you. Anxiety doesn't get to decide how you live your life. And number three, and I leave the best for last, is to provide you with one big, fat virtual hug. Because experiencing anxiety ain't easy. If that sounds good to you, let's go. Today, we are going to start with the I Did a Hard Thing segment. This one I particularly loved because of its depth. And, it's just such a beautiful, beautiful story. So here, I'm going to read it to you. It says, I want you to know that I'm doing hard things. One in particular was last week. My husband and I were doing yard work. I was happily leaving the house to purchase some flowers. By the way, I have harm OCD. As I was leaving, my husband said that while I'm gone, he will trim the branches off the pear tree with a tool. Just by him saying the tool, I pictured the saw in my mind. He did not even say saw. I got angry with him and I got scared. My husband wanted to talk me through my upset, but I did not want to talk at the time. I did not want to shop for flowers. And I sat and I thought, what can I do? How am I going to move forward? I need to lean into the fear. So I asked Don, my husband, to get the saw, in which I always avoided. We walked out to the pear tree, and I decided I needed to see the saw. I needed to hold the saw and trim the branch. I did need my husband for security, but I sawed 2 small branches off the tree while he stayed with me. Feeling numb, I went for flowers and planted them that day. And as the day went on, I was accomplishing the yard work and I felt better. Just retelling this brings up all kinds of emotions, but I did a very hard thing that day. I held and used the saw, which I normally avoid. I also shopped and planted for flowers, taking the upset with me. Yikes! I'm having harm OCD is really agonizing. Any kind of OCD. But I am focusing on weakening the disorder and strengthening me. This is a daily battle. You guys, this is a wonderful story, and thank you so much for sharing this. It was sent in by an anonymous follower of CBT School, and I am just so grateful for these amazing, amazing stories. In today's episode, we are touching on a very difficult topic. And the reason I started with the I Did a Hard Thing is I wanted to really start strong and remind you guys how incredibly courageous and amazing you all are. And I know that together we can come to have this very important and difficult conversation about suicide. In the last few weeks, we sadly have lost a member of the CBT School community, a very, very valued and loved member who was very, very, like I said, just loved within the group and supported within the group on the Facebook group, and who had a very, very ongoing battle with mental illness. And unfortunately, we did lose this beautiful, beautiful human to suicide. And my heart is breaking. And I know you guys don't want to listen to this. And I know you probably want to turn this episode off. But I really beg you to stay. We have invited the incredible Joe Dennis to have a conversation with us around the topic of suicide. And yep, I already know nobody wants to have this conversation, but these are the conversations we have to have. Now, when I heard about this news, one part of me wanted to just keep it quiet, not mention it to anyone, not alert anybody to it, and just hope and hope that everyone could go along with their day and continue to feel empowered through each other. But then the other part of me grew and grew, knowing that we have to have a conversation about suicide. It is an ongoing problem here in the West. And it is something that we can't turn our faces away from, because the truth is, statistics show that the majority of people with an anxiety disorder have had some kind of thoughts of suicide. Now, that's not to say that they will go through with it, but the truth is we often will have these kinds of thoughts. And I wanted to bring on a professional, Joe Dennis, who can help me, because I am a little too raw to be doing this episode on my own. I myself have had very, very dear loved ones who have died by suicide in my life. So I knew I wasn't capable of doing this subject justice by doing it on my own. And I was so grateful to Joe. I just reached out to him and he scheduled it the next day, and we jumped on the call and we got this episode recorded. And I'm so grateful to him because he handles such a very difficult topic so beautifully and brings such light to such a dark topic. So thank you, Joe. I am going to go directly over to the episode, and I do encourage you guys to use the tools and use the resources that he has provided, because they are incredibly helpful, and that is what we need to do. We need to be talking about this and sharing it and asking questions and checking in with our loved ones and making sure we're all okay. We don't want to just do this on Suicide Prevention Week, because that's a whole week of the year that we talk about it. But the truth is we need to be talking about it all year round. So I'm just going to take it over to the episode, and I'm just sending you guys love. I know this is hard. I want you to hold your heart as we go through it, but please do listen to the end. Please don't let yourself off the hook here and just, turn this episode off, because this might be one of the most important episodes we create. Okay? I love you guys. I'm sending you so much love. I'm really hoping that you have support as you listen to this. It may be triggering in some areas. And if not, please do jump onto CBT School Campus, the Facebook group, because I know a lot of the members there have been processing this together and talking about it and being an absolute beautiful community for each other. So all my love to you, and I'll talk to you soon. Well, welcome. I have Joe Dennis with me here today, and I am so grateful to have Joe to be here with us today. He is the clinical director of the Mindful Counseling in Utah, and he's also a very well-known trauma specialist. So welcome, Joe.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you for coming on and talking with us about such an important conversation. I have some questions for you, but do you want to just give me a little background on you and what your training is all about?
Certainly. So I've been practicing for, about 7.5 years formally as a therapist. And my specialty comes out of some intense supervision, numerous trainings, readings, and honestly, kind of in my opinion, my own personal experiences. About a decade ago, I was diagnosed with PTSD. I went through some just very enjoyable treatment. That was pure sarcasm. I know that doesn't always come through a podcast. Trauma treatment is rough, but made it through it. And within that, I was able to see this wonderful hope that comes out of effective treatment. So that kind of called me into the field.
I think we're all recovering from something as therapists, right?
Yes, the term, what is it? We're all bleeding hearts.
Yes. Yes, I resonate with that a lot. So you're here really to help me and help us all as we process a loss of our community. So I wanted to have you on to really speak about suicide and for us to dive in here on a topic that I think we don't talk about enough. So can you first tell us, why do we call it death by suicide?
Right. So, to understand the phrase death by suicide, I think we need to understand why not commit suicide, why not use that phrase. To say commit or committing, it often brings to mind a moral or legal issue. So, like committing a sin, committing a crime, something of that sort. So, to say someone has committed suicide implies shame on them and their family, and it's not exactly the most uplifting phrase. Death by suicide recognizes that there's an underlying cause. There's a something behind the suicide. I usually will refer to suicide as being a symptom of a mental health disorder. In a similar way, you could say, let's say someone has diabetes and they go into a diabetic coma and they end up dying following organ failure. You would get some really odd looks if you said they committed organ failure. It doesn't make sense. More likely, you'd say something like they died from complications of diabetes. So in the same way, you can say someone has died by suicide. You can also use the phrase they've completed suicide. But sort of my favorite way to say it is that they died as a complication of addiction or depression, anxiety, PTSD, whatever was underlying.
Right. Now, this is such an important topic. Why do you think there is shame? Why? Tell us a little bit about the shame underlying suicide and even just the word.
This ultimately can get into so many different realms. If you are taking into consideration culture, family, history, expectations, really it ends up lying in this idea of how things are supposed to go, how things should go. And when we internalize these experiences of perceived failure, we experience shame. So if suicide is an action of failure, it's admitting defeat or something of that sort, shame is the natural consequence of it.
And it's particularly hard, I think, for the family that's left behind, the shame
Absolutely.
that they feel. Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's important as we first get started is I'd love if you could explain the difference between what I would call passive suicidal ideation or, actual suicide ideation. Do you want to sort of speak to that a little bit? Because some people are so new to this or they're too ashamed to even ask.
Absolutely.
Can you break it down?
Certainly. So passive suicidal ideation, it's very, very common. I would say the bulk of my clients, I will say my clients admit to passive suicidal ideation, where friends and family may not, but it's incredibly common. Most individuals will have a thought of suicidal ideation at some point in their lives, and it will be pretty fleeting or passing. It may be a thought of, it would be nice if I weren't here. That is a form of passive suicidal ideation. Now, if you put this into more of a spectrum, you have on one end maybe just a fleeting thought, then you might add into it on the other end of the spectrum some fantasies of suicide. I know when I was actively in treatment, I had suicidal episodes myself. And I would have a fleeting thought driving on the freeway of, if I let go of my steering wheel, I will hit at that point on the barrier. And it wouldn't go anything beyond that, but it would be this brief moment, this brief realization. Still frightening, don't get me wrong. And that is bordering into active suicidal ideation. So active means that there's a plan, there's intent, there's means, and then you can even argue that there's time and location planned out. When it transitions from passive into active or actual, there is a little bit more purpose behind it. There's a little bit more decision there.
And what would suggest for somebody if they were, from one end of the spectrum of the other in terms of like, would you suggest a different treatment for different areas of the spectrum?
I would say urgency really is the main difference. If there's been prolonged passive suicidal ideation, or there's just an increasing severity to it, maybe the fantasies are becoming more vivid or more frequent, or if your suicidality, your ideation is more active and you're beginning to make plans, maybe you're beginning to decide who would get different prized possessions, those are red flags. As the ideation becomes more present, more active, the urgency to seek assistance through therapy, even through possibly hospitalization, becomes more necessary.
Right, absolutely. Why do you think people struggle to put their hand up and talk about these issues?
So death alone is a very touchy subject. It's universal stress goes along with the idea of death. That gets into, that could be an entire podcast on itself. But you mix in there faith systems, cultural movements, sensitivities, families, social histories, you're guaranteed to offend and scare someone by discussing suicide. It's a definite reality. And so, as a general rule, we don't like offending one another. We don't like anything except happiness. And we definitely don't like to bring sadness or anger or anxiety on someone else. So, in our effort to be, not a burden, we don't like to discuss our own experiences around mental health, let alone suicide. So, it just requires that vulnerability that is so terrifying to step into.
Right. For both people, I think.
Certainly.
I think that from my experience, when someone reports feeling suicidal or having suicidal thoughts, I think their discomfort sort of shuts the conversation down as well. Like, I don't think we have a full open conversation. And I think, would you say that it's a part of the reason is because when we do go and talk to people, often people are so frightened and feel out of control, they maybe mightn't even respond so well?
Definitely. It's those phrases like, I know how you feel. That one is not useful, not useful at all. Yeah, our natural gut reaction is to step in and fix. And we don't know what to do when someone comes up to us discussing suicidality. So we spout out these platitudes and other useless phrases and say, but don't you realize how irrational that is? Or think about who you'd be affecting. Oh yeah, all these phrases are not useful, not good.
Right. And I think that's a really important point because we don't get trained on sensitivity to these issues, nor do we get trained on how to handle them as friends and family or even people suffering themselves. So what would you suggest being a helpful thing to say to somebody who is reporting suicidal ideation?
So if you're suspecting it, be direct and ask the person if they are thinking of ending their life. Don't be vague. Don't be coy about it. That makes it awkward and weird. Just be blunt, be direct. From that, then the discussion can transition to their experiences, just being there with them. What is it like to live in that reality? You're not trying to solve anything. You're not trying to change anything. You're just trying to hear them out. That is really the emphasis of being there for anyone that's in panic, or if they're in a flashback, if they are suicidal, any of these experiences. If you are actively connected there with them, their chances of actually going through completing suicide are drastically decreased. In the discussion, chances are you can transition into discussing how to empower them to decrease their access to lethal items and means. That would be something like, and as they're talking about their plan, they might say, they're thinking of using a gun. So then you could ask them, well, do you have a gun here? And they could say yes. And you could say, would you like me to hold on to it until you'd like it back? And you could do that depending on the state.
Right.
So there's legalities there. But ultimately, listen carefully to how the person is thinking and feeling. If they want the resources, you can leave them with. Actually, I wrote down, while I'm thinking of it, I wrote down some basic resources for anyone that is contemplating suicide or even really wanting more information. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, that's 1-800-273-8255. There's also this really awesome, it's a crisis text line. So you text home to 741-741, and that'll get you set up.
It's wonderful.
Of course.
And so I think you've talked beautifully about how to talk to somebody, if you're dealing with someone who is having suicidal ideation. What if ourselves are the ones going through that? What would you suggest?
So ultimately, suicidality, it's a symptom of suffering and isolation. So from that, if you can find ways to connect with others, to especially individuals who you trust already, just kind of up your vulnerability a little bit, that can make a world of a difference. Well, I can just tell you what I did, some firsthand. So after the realization that if I was left to my own devices, I would be ending my life, let me just give you a slight bit of backstory here. I'm really stubborn. I'm a very stubborn person, and I ignored very blatant risks of my mental well-being. I was getting flashbacks and panic attacks from all kinds of things, and it was getting worse and worse and worse. And then I would try and sleep, and panic attacks and etc. would just get even worse from there. So my reality had become, should I have panic attacks and a miserable life, or should I end it? So it was at that point I realized, okay, I need to quit being so stubborn. I found a trauma specialist who I clicked well with. And also, this is a little suggestion for those who should seek a therapist. Find one that won't let you get too comfortable. I could go a little bit further on that. But I found things that were causing me to isolate more, which was video gaming stuff. I unplugged those. I sold it off. I limited my screen time in general. I quit sleeping in and I quit napping. This is something very common to depression, that depression sleep, it just seems so nice and numbing, but it makes things dramatically worse. So if you can limit that to 7 to 9 hours, that for most individuals, that's ideal. I drew more. I painted more. I did more creative outlets. I connected with a few of my very close friends and let them know what was going on. I let them know pieces of my trauma story. And I took a lot of walking meditations, got out of my dorm and meditated. That's really when I brought that into my regular routine.
Right. I resonate, and I've heard many people talk about sort of that stubbornness. Can you share a little bit about, so you were struggling, obviously, and in that moment, I think so many people who are depressed and suicidal, it's almost like facing their problems feels so overwhelming. And that's one of the reasons they don't. But could you shed some light on why do you think you were stubborn? What do you think what was going on for you at that point?
Well, to ask for help was to admit that I couldn't do it on my own. And that was such, that's a blow to the ego. And I historically, I've had a pretty potent ego. Trauma has a way of shattering that, just saying. It was as if I could just figure out the problem. If I could just think hard enough and conceptualize what was going on, well enough, then maybe I could plan my way out of it. That had been really a coping mechanism up to that point. It had been very effective in getting me through, well, college, getting me through a lot of my life, but it did not work. It had stopped working. There had been enough stressors hit all at once that my ability to cope was overcome.
Right. And I love the way you share that, because you're ultimately saying it wasn't a lack of strength. It wasn't a weakness. It was just a buildup of symptoms that got overwhelming, right? I think sometimes we feel like it's our fault that, this is a result, this suicidal ideation is a result of our weakness or something like that.
Right.
Right. And you're really clearly saying like it just built up and it became less effective. And then it got to the point where you needed to ask for help.
Yeah. There was too much.
Right. Right. So for you, how long was that process of, coming out of, like, should someone who's had suicidal ideation expect that to go away? Is it something that will continuously sort of linger? What's your experience or your professional advice on that?
So that one's harder to answer because that's going to depend ultimately on the individual. There are some people that will have a degree of lingering, more passive suicidality. Now, that said, especially with some meditative practices and recognizing acceptance, actively practicing awareness, noting that your thoughts are merely thoughts, and practicing accepting them and letting them go. It's a very typical deep meditation. The ability to kind of recognize, oh, there's that passive suicidal thought again, whatever, let it go. That becomes more frequent until the thoughts are dissipated. Now, I can tell you, these days, I wouldn't meet criteria for PTSD anymore. Panic attacks, flashbacks, they just flat out, they don't exist currently. Now, when I am under high stress, though, there will be moments where I will have the little, how do I explain it? It's sort of a flicker of this old feeling of that frantic ideation. I know now what that is, what that experience is. And so I can recognize it, go, oh, it's that thing. Okay, let that be. That's sort of the alarm that I need to decrease some stress. And it ends up actually serving me. It ends up being a very useful alarm.
Right. It's like a red flag that can notify you that you need to go back to those basic tools, like the reaching out and stuff.
Yes.
It's so important that because you're connected, you're listening for that voice, not afraid of it, but listening for it because there's a message associated with it. Is that what you'd say?
I would totally agree.
Does it still scare you?
No. It's something that I will guide my clients through. It's sort of a mockery of a meditation, honestly. I have them close their eyes and picture themselves doing jumping jacks. And then I ask them, are you picturing yourself doing jumping jacks? And they'll nod their head. And then I'll say, are you doing jumping jacks right now? And they'll say, well, no. And I'll say, correct. Now open your eyes. That's really as simple as it is. We can get frightened of our own thoughts because our brain is so effective at confusing fantasy with reality. But when we can distinguish, a thought is simply, it's a bunch of electricity going off in your brain. It isn't anything else. It isn't reality. When we can separate that, we can do so much more with it. We remove the power from it.
I really like that activity. I haven't heard it being done that way.
Thank you.
It's cool. It's cool. You talked briefly, and I'd love if you could go in a little more in depth of what are some of the things that underlie when it comes to suicide. What are this, it doesn't just, we don't just arrive at suicidal ideation. What might be going on underneath all of that?
Right. So I know you've talked about some of this sort of neurological pattern in some of the other episodes, but just as a refresher, I think it's useful to go through more neurologically what's going on when your brain is experiencing this anxiety and such. So we have your prefrontal cortex, the front of your brain, and that's responsible. I tell my clients it's the area responsible for your ability to play Tetris. So it's all about spatial recognition, planning, reasoning, etc. So then there's your midbrain, and that's sort of your toddler brain. It's responsible for stress response, fight, flight, freeze, appease, and emotions. It wants pleasure and it doesn't want pain, and it doesn't understand the concept of later. So it's all very immediate. And so the midbrain, its primary responsibility is survival, where your prefrontal cortex is about thriving. The more the midbrain is active, the more the prefrontal cortex shuts down. So set that aside for a sec. As I said before, that suicide is a result of intense suffering and isolation. So all human beings suffer. It's a guaranteed part of existence. It's our natural wiring. It's just reality. So because we have suffering, we seek relief. This is, when our prefrontal cortex is active, we can make wise decisions leading to lasting relief and resolving suffering. However, when it's inactive, we make far more desperate gambles toward things that look like they could be relief. So put this all together. The brain is drenched in isolation and has suffering from whichever mental health disorder. It slips into that midbrain driven mode that's devoid of reasoning. So, because your brain is wired to decrease thinking and rationality as your suffering increases, the more suffering goes on, the more desperately you seek relief. This might lead to substance use, other numbing methods, but eventually those really stop cutting it. And then all that's left is the option of suicide. So I guess the shorthand way of putting that is your brain is wired to frantically find ways to develop relief as suffering increases. So therefore, as suffering reaches a peak, your body becomes so desperate to end suffering that the only reasonable option is suicide.
Right. And you think that, and just so for everyone who's listening, because I know everyone has an array of different reasons they're here listening, you think that would be true for PTSD and depression and anxiety and all of the disorders?
All the above.
Would you say depression is at the forefront, or would you say that's not accurate?
I'm not sure. I think that would actually be interesting to look into. Depression would make sense because it does tend to have that heavier, more pessimistic view, that lack of hope that tends to go along with suicide, as well as the pattern of isolation. So, I mean, just logically, that would make sense. But I'm not sure, statistically on that.
Right. Well, I know it's true for a lot of our listeners who are dealing with some kind of anxiety disorder. OCD is you're so in fight and flight mode all day long. It makes sense that, it mightn't even be that it has to be a ton of depression. It's just that you're activated so highly. Who wouldn't want to end that discomfort that you're feeling all day long? It makes total sense for that it could be multiple different things. I think a lot of people who are listening here, have experienced panic to the worst degree. And so I think I 100% agree with what you're saying here, is that it would be very interesting to look at the statistics there. Okay, for those who are listening, what advice, I know you've given the hotline and some really great tools here. Is there anything else that you would introduce to them, or a message you would want to give to them if they're feeling hopeless and suicidal?
So I like to say that hopelessness occurs from the past. It occurs when we are focused on past events, and we're allowing those past events to negatively dictate our present. So we have to actually, this is kind of counterintuitive, but we have to allow the possibility that we're actually wrong. If we are wrong, that allows the possibility that there's a right answer, that there's difference, that there is actually hope, that there are possibilities, that there can be change and just awesome things in our future. But that requires us to be wrong.
Right. Tell me a bit about that, because I think I immediately sort of had this thing of like, oh, okay, how do we wrestle with that? Because a lot of people don't want to wrestle with that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'm one of those. It's quit being so stubborn. Yeah, a more friendly way of thinking of it. Think of yourself as a student. The student has a basic understanding of maybe some equations, some 10-10 classes, but they would never step into the position of a professor. They don't have that kind of information yet. So if you allow yourself to take that sort of role, that where you're a student, you allow others to have information that is possibly useful for you. It could possibly add to the equations that you have in mind. That allows there to be some possibility within your future.
So you're talking about the beginner's mind.
Yeah.
Being open. We actually have an episode early in the piece about the beginner's mind. So what you're saying is be curious to the fact that you don't know what you don't know at this time.
Yes, absolutely.
Interesting. And from there, once you've allowed for the possibility that you're wrong, what might you do in your professional opinion?
So I'm not the one that came up with this, interestingly. I'm not that much of a genius. It was Socrates. Socrates argued that to develop wisdom, we have to recognize that in the scope of things, we don't know. We don't have the full picture. So from that empty state, that beginner's mind, you are able to take in reasoning. That's just the acquisition of knowledge. And then you have what Socrates called, divine inspiration. And now philosophers will argue back and forth about what he meant by that. But that divine inspiration is that aha moment where the dots are connected, where all that information just sort of settles and makes sense. Meditation is a great way to help sort of fertilize the soil that information can kind of bloom from. But from this point of reasoning plus divine inspiration, we develop wisdom. So we develop that sense of positivity and hopefulness for the future.
Right. I love that because I think that can be sprinkled on every person's treatment, right? At some point, starting with treatment, I think when I reflect back, like the first day you go to treatment and you're in a therapist office, you have to accept that you might be wrong. You're going because you've surrendered to that. And I think that there's some beauty to that here as well, even in such a really heavy, topic.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Joe, I'm so grateful. Is there anything else that you feel we've missed or that we should mention in regards to this topic, this very difficult topic?
Remember, if you get anything out of this episode, it's the importance of connection. It's been argued that most mental health issues would not occur if we were just effectively connected with one another. Now, I think that's interesting to consider and debate, but it's a lovely thought. The other part here is there is such an important piece of stepping into therapy. It's such a relief to allow someone else to be the expert on your particular brand of insanity. And this is a very much aside. Medication, when it comes to suicidality, medication is recommended. It's not necessarily that you're going to be on it forever, so don't let that weigh on you. Medication doesn't mean anything. It just means that you are going to be able to increase the effectiveness of treatment, possibly, or increase some stability. Now, on this idea, if you're currently on a medication and you're experiencing suicidality, get those medications checked because there are cases, I've actually worked on a couple of these cases, where it was the medication itself bringing on the suicidality. It's a very odd side effect. And if that's the case, altering the medication is a night and day difference.
Right. I think that's really good advice. Right. And is there anything else that you feel we really need to make sure that we're addressing in regards to this topic?
For the most part, I think we got it. But just as a reminder, you absorb everything around you. And this really emphasizes the importance of kind of clearing out your Insta-gunk. Go through your social media, those individuals that when you look at their profile or their posts, it just makes you feel disheartened and despair. at least mute those ones, if not remove them from your connection.
Yeah. And for me, it was beyond social media. It was like turning off the news.
Yeah.
And maybe reducing the contact with people who are fairly toxic and increasing with the people who, like in our community here at CBT School, of being around like-minded people who are going through similar struggles, I think can be huge in feeling connected. I think you're spot on there.
Absolutely.
Joe, I'm so grateful for you and your expertise and for being so open. I really, really cannot tell you how grateful I am that you came on, because I think we're all very raw and we all needed you, and myself included, because this is an episode I could not have done by myself, feeling as how I feel. So can you tell us how we can hear more about you?
Certainly. So probably the thing I'm most frequently jumping on and updating is my Instagram, and that's at joedennis.counsels. You can also you can check out the clinic. That's mindful counseling. You can also check us out online, and that's mindfulcounselingutah.com.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much.
Of course.
Please note that this podcast or any other resources from cbtschool.com should not replace professional mental health care. If you feel you would benefit, please reach out to a provider in your area. Have a wonderful day, and thank you for supporting cbtschool.com.